It is an honor to be here. This is a phenomenal group of folks that you've brought together to be a part of this. We worked very closely with Willa in our early days with Strive, and obviously FSG did a great job coming to town and capturing what this work was all about. And then Dan and Karen and others are really fantastic examples of doing this work well. And it's so exciting to see what John and the team here at the Aspen Community Foundation have done since we first started talking with them. They came to a convening, and it may not feel like it, but we feel like you all have made a lot of progress. I got to say that though it is an honor to be here, there was one downside. I didn't realize I was going to be traveling on Valentine's Day. And that went over like a lead balloon when I had to tell my wife and my 4 kids. That wasn't too cool. But when I told them I was going to Aspen, it was all downhill from there. It was all downhill from there. You can't tell a family member, pretty much anybody, you're going to Aspen without a bit of jealousy creeping up. So I now understand why, though. This is the first time I've been here, and it is absolutely spectacular. So my role in this particular panel is going to be to begin to take it from conceptual to practical, right? And I am ecstatic to be a part of the discussion because our sense is that you all have already figured out this visual flashed up on the screen, that when we talk about education, it is not just all about the Little Red Schoolhouse, right? And we've pretty much all experienced education, while the quality may have differed, in a similar way, right? We went to a building, we went to a classroom where there may have been desks, there was a now a whiteboard, back then a chalkboard. We all pretty much experienced it the same way. But what I think communities are coming to is that schools are definitely a critical piece of the puzzle, but there's early childhood, as was discussed earlier by the Assistant Secretary, there's workforce. But there's also all the nonprofits that work in our community. And we have to somehow bring them all together to equal this cradle-to-career success for every child, right? That's what we've got to do. So we didn't know it was called collective impact. We were actually calling it synergy back in 2004 when folks started to come together in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. And I had the honor of being the founding director, the founding cat herder, as we do so affectionately call it, essentially the role that John is taking on at this point. And I have to just first say this. How many folks have read that collective impact article? How many folks have read it? Okay, not quite as many as I thought, so I will have to go into a little bit more detail. But the bottom line is that is a wonderful article, but it is the most sanitized version of reality that has ever existed. Right? The question we get asked most is, it feels like you guys just snapped your fingers and all of a sudden everybody was playing nice. Right? But the truth of the matter is that my wife tells me all the time that I now have gray hair, and quite frankly, it came from the fact that there were tons of mistakes made along the way. There were tons of things that if I could go back and change, I even call these sessions therapy sessions because I get to tell you about all the ways that we had to fail forward, right, in trying to build this cradle-to-career civic infrastructure. But the bottom line is that's where the gray hair came from. There were certainly successes, and that's what they documented. But the journey from a session like this, where we had over 250 community partners in a room saying, how could we get a better return on our investment? And Cincinnati, believe it or not, is one of the most giving communities in the country. It's got one of the largest United Ways, largest community foundations, incredibly large corporations that give a lot of money to kids. The question became, how could we get better results if consistently we feel like we're at uneven at best, right? How could we get better results? And it was the coroner of our community who stood up at the time, and he said, listen, we are program rich and system poor, right? We are program rich and system poor. And I'm going to keep seeing youth dead on my tables, much less more kids going to college, unless we figure out a way to become system rich, right? That became the call to action in our region. And quite frankly, what I gather from Aspen to Parachute, regardless of the wealth that may exist, there are similar challenges, right? And it dawned upon us that we were essentially taking a spray and pray approach to serving children. We were literally just spraying resources all over the place and praying that really good things happen. But quite frankly, they weren't, right? They weren't. They were for some, but they weren't for enough. So the journey of going from some cradle-to-career vision that we eventually had, right? This is what we created. It said essentially that learning starts at birth. It goes through some form of college. There's academic benchmarks kids need to hit, but there's also social-emotional benchmarks. Just getting agreement that this is what education was all about. There were tons of lessons there, right? There were tons of lessons there. And then making the movement to actually saying, okay, you know what? There's actually some big goals that if we collectively work together, we may be able to achieve, that every kid would be prepared, supported, succeeds, enrolls, and graduates. That was a big deal, right? Just getting agreement across a community of partners like this on those big goals was a big step. But even more importantly, and even more difficult, was getting agreement on outcomes, right? And we very quickly learned that big goals are wonderful, but big goals don't get you very far when it comes down to the everyday work on the ground. And it took us a very long time to kind of get agreement on what would these 8 outcomes be. And from what I've heard from John, there's about 50 plus of you in this room that have been part of conversations already to begin to narrow down what those outcomes might be for your region. They won't be the same as this, I'm quite positive, right? There may be some that are the same. We now work with 20 communities hand in hand, and we've got 85 members, or 85 communities that are a part of a national network. And most of them have something around kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, high school graduation, maybe college completion. But every community's outcomes, all in all, are somewhat different, right? But a big learning for us was that, quite frankly, collective impact cannot happen if you do not agree on these outcomes. Because every single meeting that we had started with 2 things, that roadmap and these outcomes. And we reminded ourselves every day that unless we worked together in very purposeful ways, we weren't going to move the dial, right? That had to happen. So we were fortunate to be able to have a group come together and say, we're going to be very transparent about reporting those outcomes. So every year now, for each of those 8 outcomes, for the 3 urban school districts, public school districts, and the parochial school districts, for the early childhood community and higher ed, we report very transparently where are their green arrows and where are their red, right? And the critical piece here is that the community leaders, the business community with the public schools who had been knocking heads for years, or the parochial schools with the public schools that had been knocking heads for years, they stopped pointing fingers at each other and started to say, we all share accountability for results, right? A mantra for us became shared accountability, but differentiated responsibility. Everybody in our community has different roles to play, but we all share accountability for every single one of these outcomes. The good news is that across those 8 outcomes and across these systems, consistently over the last 5 years, we've seen more outcomes, we've seen more green arrows every year trending in the right direction, right? And it hasn't been from starting new stuff. We have, in the 8 years that Strive has existed, started exactly 2 new initiatives. The work that's been done is to identify the existing work in our community, identify what some of you are already doing, identify the practices that get results, and then spread them as far as we can across all the existing systems and programs that are already serving children, right? So I'm going to give you an example of that, but I want to say that we were fortunate very early on in this, in 2008, to be funded by a group called Living Cities. And they gave us some resources to literally have a person whose full-time job it was to just look and watch and try to learn from what we were doing. And that was a little awkward for me, to be quite honest, because this person was literally in all of these meetings, and it was actually bordering on annoying. But it paid off in the long run, right? It paid off in the long run. And what we came up with was essentially a framework. And we don't call it a model very intentionally, because for those of you who have been to Cincinnati, you'd find, and this may come as a surprise, that it is very different than Aspen. It is different than Aspen. I just want to put that out there very clearly, right? But it is a framework because we do think that there are some things that you can pay attention to, and if you do pay attention to, you're going to get better results, right? And I'm just going to walk through a concrete example of each of these 4 pillars in the framework so you can get an idea of very practically on the ground how this might come together. So the first is shared community vision. And this is really about building what we call an accountability structure, not a governance structure, very intentionally, because governance structure is laden with 501c3-ness, right? And what we're trying to say is it really has to be a community coming together around a set of outcomes to say we will all hold ourselves accountable. And a mantra here for us was clarity is critical. What we had to do in building this accountability structure was outline very specifically what are the roles and responsibilities of all these different players and how can they actively get involved in moving those 8 outcomes, right? The second pillar is evidence-based decision making. And the bottom line on this one is getting agreement on those outcomes. I showed you the 8 for Cincinnati. There is no more important body of work that you will take on than the 50 folks here who are trying to agree on what those outcomes will be. And a critical learning for us here, another mantra for us, was don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? We have a tendency in the social sector to want the perfect measures for everything. There is no perfect measure. So what we had to do was land on the outcomes that we felt comfortable enough measuring consistently and work towards getting better measures over time. Right? So an example, one of ours was early literacy. Right? There was an early childhood community that was absolutely frustrated that it wasn't about developmental readiness. But what that group did was, rather than complain, they went and developed a measure for developmental readiness. And so next year, for the very first time, we will have a measure on this report card of developmental readiness by kindergarten. But we didn't let not having that measure stop us from acting. We kept going. Right? The third piece is collaborative action. The third piece is collaborative action, and this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the rubber meets the road, where around each of the outcomes, and I'll show you a visual of this in a minute, but around each of the outcomes, the providers and the system heads and all the players that improve that outcome actually come together and work to identify things that get results. So I'll give you an example around tutoring, around third grade reading, right? Third grade reading. For years, we had been pulling together the tutoring programs, and for years, we had not been able to figure out how to help those adults get involved to turn that number around. Finally, the school district got involved, and we were able to look at the data, and it turned out that if a child had an adult working with them consistently once a week for at least an hour and had the data in their hands on what that kid needed to learn, right? Was it fractions, right? Was it punctuation? If they had that data, those kids did better, right? But rather than start a bunch of new programs, the existing tutoring programs agreed, we will make sure our tutors come at least once a week for an hour and are trained, and the district said, we'll make sure you have the data, right? In the 16 lowest performing schools, they're getting better results at third grade reading, not because we started some newfangled thing, but because the players came together, looked at what worked, and did more of it. Does that make sense? I'm about out of time, so investment in sustainability, the bottom half of the roadmap here, is critical on two fronts. One is getting the funders to work together, private and public. Right, to actually get them to work together and ask the funders if they could identify what are the outcomes. For us, it was those 8 again. What are the outcomes they care about? And would they consider encouraging those programs that they invest in to be a part of these networks? Because if they're a part of the networks, we can begin to develop the action plans that will help us get those better results. But most importantly, it's this anchor entity, the backbone, as FSG so eloquently called it. And there are 3 roles that have to be played. I would say this definitively, right? Number 1 is the chief cat herder. John, good luck, right? Number 2 is the data analyst. You've got to have a data analyst, somebody who wakes up every day thinking about one thing and one thing only, and that's getting the data into the hands of the practitioners so that they can do their job well, not publishing data in the newspaper, right? Because we don't want data to be used as a hammer. As our friends at Data Quality Campaign say, we want it to be used as a flashlight, right? To help us find things that work, not punitive, but productive, right? And the last role is facilitators who actually can get into these networks and help them deliver and develop action plans. You've got to have these 3 roles in place, or quite frankly, over time, the energy starts to peter out. So just to give you a very quick illustration of what it might look like on the ground, we strongly recommend that there needs to be this backbone organization, right? And if you think about the gray as the backbone, that's the people who do this cat herding. Make sure everybody's coming together and committed to the vision, making sure that the data is being transparently put out there once a year to be honest about where we're headed, and making sure that the data is getting in the hands of the practitioners. But there's also these convener roles, right, around each of the outcomes. And we strongly recommend not forming networks around strategies, but forming networks around outcomes. Because the outcome becomes the true north, right? Where is that network going? But over time, you're going to need conveners, and these could be community leaders just like yourselves who say, I care about kindergarten readiness. I'm going to play the convening role to bring the right practitioners together to get results. Does that make sense? So the bottom line is that there's several things that are fundamentally critical to answer one of the questions that I think was asked at the end of the last session. One is you've got to have executive level champions. It feels top down, but in the end, if the people who have their finger on the button aren't really working together and committed to the outcomes, it's not going to work. You got to have the staff in place. You have to be willing to be transparent with data, both at the community level and the practitioners, right? It's scary stuff because I know data is used to beat people up, but you have to be willing to share both your programmatic data and your outcome data. You've got to have community engagement plans, and you have to be able to identify as early as possible. Willa talks about quick wins. What are those collaborative action plans that could get momentum, right? My bet is there's already something going on in this community that is using data, that is getting results. Lift that up right away, right? Lift it up right away. So all this to say is that we've got a lot of momentum going on around the country, and we are just elated that all of you have come together, that you're thinking about taking this on. It is the long, hard slog, but I can say that you are well positioned. I'm able to travel all over the country now, to the dismay of my 2 sets of twins and my wife. And that is where I got the ability to cat herd. Let me just put that out there. That is absolutely where I got it. But I do have the privilege, and I can say that the fact that you have the staffing in place, the fact that you're already working on your data points, right? You're already well on the way to getting to results. And if you can have the patience, to really let the data do the talking, I think you guys are going to really be a leader on the national front. So thanks again for the opportunity.